The sun burned high over the city, and the public pool was packed. Families sprawled on lounge chairs, kids splashed in the shallow end, and lifeguards scanned the water with sharp eyes. The sound of laughter and splashing echoed like a soundtrack of summer. But in seconds, it all changed. Near the middle of the pool, a scream pierced the heat. A young girl's head dipped under the water, her arms thrashing before vanishing beneath the surface. Gasps, then shouts as erupted. Parents froze, children stopped playing, and time itself seemed to hesitate. The girl didn't come back up. Welcome to Black Community Stories. Make sure you like and subscribe for your top-notch stories. In that heartbeat of panic, Jamal, a black lifeguard with a strong build and years of training, bolted forward. His chair hit the ground behind him as he sprinted toward the edge, dove into the blue water, and cut through with powerful strokes. Every second mattered. He reached the girl just as her body went limp, bubbles escaping her mouth. Wrapping an arm under her, he dragged her upward, breaking the surface with a heavy gasp. "I got her!" Jamal shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. People rushed to the pool's edge, hands covering mouths, cell phones rising to record. He carried her to the side, lifted her trembling body onto the concrete, and climbed out beside her. Her skin was pale, her chest unmoving. Kneeling, he pressed his ear to her lips, then locked his hands together and began compressions. 1, 2, 3, he counted under his breath, pumping her chest with steady force. Then he tilted her head, pinched her nose, and gave her 2 quick breaths. The crowd held its breath. Mothers clutched their children. Fathers craned their necks. Lifeguards stood frozen, letting Jamal take charge. The girl's chest heaved. A cough rattled out, followed by a spray of water. She gasped, then choked again, air clawing its way back into her lungs. "She's breathing," Jamal called, relief flashing across his face. Applause broke out. A few people clapped wildly, others cheered, and the tense silence turned into grateful noise. The girl's mother rushed forward, dropping to her knees, tears streaming as she cradled her daughter's damp face. Jamal sat back, drenched and exhausted but relieved. For a moment everything felt clear. A life had been saved. People had witnessed a miracle of training, speed, and courage. But as the minutes ticked on, something in the air shifted. The mother's sobs quieted, her hand lingering over her daughter's chest. The father stood nearby, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowing on Jamal. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Cell phones that had captured the rescue stayed raised, lenses now focused more on Jamal than on the girl. The applause died down. The cheers turned into hushed conversations. Some faces that moments ago had looked thankful now looked uneasy. The mother's teary gratitude hardened into suspicion as her gaze lingered on where Jamal's hands had been during the CPR. Before we dive in deeply, let us know in the comments what country or which city you're watching this story from. We'd love to know how far this story travels. Jamal, still kneeling by the girl, didn't notice the quick glances, the pointing, the murmurs growing louder. To him, he had done his duty. But to others, something else entirely was beginning to take shape. The poolside that had been filled with cheers only minutes ago grew tense and uneasy. Parents pulled their children closer, as if some invisible line had been crossed. The girl's mother clutched her daughter tightly, but her eyes didn't leave Jamal. Her expression was no longer relief, it was scrutiny. Jamal wiped the water from his face and looked down at the teenager who was now breathing steadily. Her chest rose and fell, shaky but alive. He felt a weight lifting. He had saved her. Yet the silence creeping through the crowd was heavier than any weight on his shoulders. "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice firm but calm, trying to break the air of unease. "She's breathing," the mother replied, her words short and clipped. She didn't thank him. Her arms wrapped tighter around her daughter, shielding her, her gaze burning into Jamal with a mix of protectiveness and something else, something sharp. A man in the crowd muttered under his breath, loud enough for others to hear. "Did you see where his hands were?" Another voice answered, hushed but quick. "He touched her too much. It didn't look right." Jamal's stomach tightened. He heard the words, though he kept his focus steady, kneeling beside the girl and checking her pulse. His training guided him, but his instincts warned him the situation was turning. More whispers spread like wildfire. Some people frowned, others folded their arms, and the atmosphere shifted from gratitude to doubt. A woman raised her phone higher, zooming in on Jamal as if the moment of rescue was now evidence of something else. The father finally spoke, his voice hard. "Why were you on her like that?" Jamal blinked, stunned. "Sir, I was doing CPR. Your daughter wasn't breathing. I had to." The man's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw grinding. "You didn't have to touch her like that. I saw it. Everyone here saw it." Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. A lifeguard from the other side of the pool walked closer, unsure of what to do, his eyes darting between Jamal and the family. "He saved her," the lifeguard said softly, almost defensively. But his words didn't carry enough weight to cut through the building tension. Jamal felt his heart pound. His training had prepared him for drowning, for broken bones, for heat strokes. But it had never prepared him for this, for being treated like a threat in the very moment he was supposed to be a hero. He stood slowly, his drenched uniform clinging to him, his shadow falling over the girl and her family. "I did my job," he said, his voice low but steady. The mother didn't respond. She pulled her daughter closer, as if Jamal's presence was dangerous. In the distance, the sound of sirens began to rise, faint at first, then growing louder. The crowd shifted, people whispering, phones pointing, capturing every second. Relief that emergency help was on the way was tangled with something darker: anticipation, suspicion, judgment. Jamal swallowed hard. He knew help was coming, but it no longer felt like help for him. It felt like something else entirely. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the pool's surface before the squad cars even pulled to a stop. The crowd, now swollen with curious onlookers, parted as two uniformed officers strode toward the scene. Their boots echoed against the hot pavement, and the energy shifted again. Fear, excitement, judgment, all tangled together in the heavy summer air. Jamal stood near the girl and her family, his hands at his sides, dripping with pool water. He was still catching his breath, but the whispers around him felt louder than his own heartbeat. He could sense where this was heading, but he forced himself to stay calm. The girl's father stepped forward before the officers even asked a question. "That man was all over my daughter," he snapped, pointing at Jamal. "He didn't just pull her out. He touched her too much. Everyone here saw it." The officer's eyes immediately shifted to Jamal, sharp and assessing. One of them, tall with a shaved head, asked flatly, "Sir, is that true?" Jamal's chest tightened. "No," he answered firmly, his voice steady though his insides twisted. I did my job. She was drowning. She wasn't breathing. I had to give CPR. The mother's arms tightened around the girl, who was still trembling, her wet hair sticking to her pale face. The mother's glare cut into Jamal like a blade. He didn't have to touch her like that, she said coldly. Someone from the crowd piped up. I saw him pressing on her chest for too long. Another voice followed. It didn't look right? The accusations were multiplying, spilling from mouths that just minutes ago had been clapping. Jamal lifted his hands slightly, not in surrender but in emphasis. Listen, he said, his tone controlled but urgent. CPR isn't gentle. It never looks right. But it saved her. She's alive because of it. The officer with the shaved head glanced at his partner, who scribbled into a notepad. We're going to need statements, he said, his tone neutral but heavy. From the family and from you, sir. The crowd pressed closer, phones still recording, feeding the tension like oxygen to fire. Jamal could feel the weight of every camera lens, every suspicious eye, locking him into a role he never asked for. Another lifeguard, Miguel, finally stepped forward, his voice shaky but clear. I was on the other side of the pool. Jamal did everything right. If he didn't act, she would have died. But Miguel's words were swallowed by the father's anger. Don't you cover for him. I saw the way he handled her. My daughter isn't a piece of meat. The girl whimpered softly, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. The sound, faint as it was, only seemed to strengthen the accusations. Jamal felt a chill, despite the blazing sun. He stood rooted in place, knowing that every move, every word would be twisted if he wasn't careful. This wasn't about CPR anymore. It was about perception. The officers exchanged another look, and one of them unclipped his radio. Dispatch, we're going to need additional units for crowd control. The sirens in the distance grew louder. The pool, once filled with splashes and laughter, was now charged with tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Jamal's eyes swept the crowd. Some faces showed doubt, others anger, and a few, just a few, looked guilty for even being part of the mob. But it didn't matter. The story was already being written right here, in whispers and camera angles, and Jamal was no longer the hero in it. The heat bore down harder as the second wave of sirens cut through the thick summer air. 2 more patrol cars rolled up beside the pool, their lights painting streaks of red and blue across the crowd. By now, nearly everyone had their phones raised. What had begun as a rescue was turning into a spectacle, and Jamal could feel the noose tightening with every passing second. Step over here, one of the officers ordered, motioning Jamal toward the pool's gate. His voice was clipped, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. Jamal obeyed, water dripping from his uniform as he walked slowly, deliberately. He kept his hands visible, his movements measured. He knew how fast things could spiral if he appeared nervous or defiant. Behind him, the father's voice rose again. That man touched my daughter. He had his hands all over her. She was helpless. And he took advantage. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Words like helpless and took advantage carried more weight than any fact. Jamal clenched his jaw, but said nothing, forcing himself to breathe. The mother stroked her daughter's wet hair, whispering to her while glaring at Jamal as if he were a predator lurking in plain sight. The girl didn't speak. Her silence only fanned the flames. Miguel, The other lifeguard edged closer to the officers. "Look, I've worked with Jamal for 3 years. He's solid. He's trained. If it was me, I'd have done the same thing. He didn't cross any line." One officer raised a hand. "We'll take your statement, sir. Right now, we need to get control of this situation." His words were calm, but his body language was tense, ready for things to turn. Jamal swallowed hard. He could feel the eyes on him, drilling into his back. Some of the kids who had once cheered were now whispering to their parents. A few older folks shook their heads as if disappointed in him, though they hadn't seen the full rescue. Truth no longer mattered. The story had taken on a life of its own. Then a man in the crowd shouted, "Lock him up." Others echoed it, voices rising like a wave. "Yeah, arrest him!" The chant rattled Jamal's nerves. But he stood firm. His heart pounded, sweat mixing with the pool water still dripping down his face. He wasn't just fighting for his reputation anymore. He was fighting for his freedom. The officer with the shaved head turned to Jamal. "We'll need you to stay calm and come with us. We have to separate you from the crowd until we get everyone's statements." Jamal looked at him, eyes steady. "I'll cooperate, but I saved her life. Don't forget that." The officer didn't respond, just gestured again for Jamal to move toward the parking lot where the patrol cars were. The crowd surged forward, phones recording, people shouting accusations, some calling for justice, others murmuring in confusion. As Jamal walked with the officers, the father's voice rang out again. She could have died in his hands. He touched her when she was unconscious. Who knows what he did? Who knows? Jamal's stomach sank. The words were poison, spilling into the air, seeping into the minds of everyone listening. By the time the truth came out, if it ever did, he knew the damage would already be done. And yet he kept walking, his wet shoes squeaking against the pavement, his figure swallowed by flashing lights and shouting voices. The story was no longer his to control. Jamal stood beside the patrol car, the sun beating down on his soaked uniform. His chest rose and fell heavily, though he forced his face to remain calm. The officers positioned themselves between him and the restless crowd, but their presence didn't ease the pressure. The chants, the whispers, the glares, all of it pressed against him like a weight he couldn't shake. The girl, now wrapped in a towel, sat on a lounge chair as her mother hovered protectively. The father paced like a caged animal, his voice rising every few minutes with new accusations. He pressed on her chest too long. His mouth was on hers when it didn't need to be. This wasn't rescue, this was something else. Every word hit Jamal like a hammer. He wanted to shout back, to scream the truth into the sea of doubting faces. But he knew the louder he protested, the more guilty he would appear, so he held his silence, his fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling with a mixture of rage and helplessness. Miguel fought to defend him. "You're twisting what happened. If Jamal hadn't moved the way he did, your daughter wouldn't be alive right now. That's the truth." But Miguel's words were drowned out. People didn't want the truth. They wanted a villain. And Jamal, standing there drenched in water and sweat, had already been cast in the role. Finally, one of the officers stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning. It's standard procedure." Jamal stared at him, his jaw tightening. Standard procedure for saving a life? The officer's expression didn't change. "For situations like this, yes." The crowd erupted in a mix of satisfaction and outrage. Some cheered, others shouted that it wasn't enough. A few people shook their heads quietly, uneasy but too afraid to speak up against the growing tide. Jamal's stomach twisted. He had been trained to pull people from the water, to fight for their breath when they couldn't. But he had never been trained for this, for being turned from a savior into a suspect in the span of minutes. As the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the cheers that had once honored him were gone. Now there were only phones capturing the moment, feeding a narrative that would outlast the truth. The teenage girl glanced at him once, her eyes wide and unreadable. Then she looked away, leaning into her mother's shoulder. That single gesture sealed the moment in the eyes of the crowd. The door of the patrol car closed with a heavy thud, muffling the voices outside. Jamal sat in silence, his wet clothes clinging to him, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. What had started as a rescue had turned into a battle for his name, his freedom, and his very identity. And as the car pulled away from the pool, one thing became clear. In the eyes of many, he was no longer the lifeguard who saved a life. He was the man accused of crossing a line. The crowd dispersed slowly, their conversations buzzing like flies around a wound. The girl was alive, breathing because of him. But Jamal's life, in that moment, felt like it had been dragged underwater, uncertain if he would ever resurface. The end. Please like and subscribe for more rich stories like this. Comment below. Also, if you really loved this video and want to support the channel directly, you can hit that super thanks button below.